I've known Jeff for around 30 years. And we've spent quite a lot of time together in 3 continents, I guess. When I thought what I would say in a few words about him, I thought that why not go to the source. And I want to basically say what Adam Smith said about Hume, although not posthumously. Upon the whole, I've always considered him as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit. But as anybody who knows him well, he's also completely mad. I mean, the driving, and I mean, just try to talk to him about modern art or, I don't know, architecture or something like that. My theory is that the deep irrationality is in order to compensate for all this deep irrationality, he is and aggressiveness, he is translating it into philosophy. And so we're fortunate to have all this goodness for us. We're fortunate to have Francis Kamm, who will speak about non-consequentialism and climate change. Thank you.
Okay, so I first want to say that I'm speaking from a kitchen in Queens, New York. So welcome to Queens, New York. It's an honor to speak. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so it's an honor to speak at a conference celebrating just Jeff. The double entendre is there. I've known Jeff for more than 30 years and benefited both from his outstanding philosophical work and his comments on my own work. I'm also grateful to Jeff for once literally saving Derek Parfit's life. I don't know if you all know the story. And also for editing volumes of essays on Parfit's life and work, which he's done more recently. This paper is part of a commentary on a paper by Professor Lucas Stanchik, and it's going to be included in a Nomos volume sponsored by the Society for Political and Legal Philosophy. In his thought-provoking paper on the moral challenge of the climate crisis, Lucas Stanchik aims to develop what he calls a non-consequentialist person-regarding ethic for climate change. Briefly put, he thinks it is non-consequentialist in focusing on the rights of persons rather than maximizing utility overall. It is person-regarding in focusing on how policies make individuals better or worse off than those particular individuals would otherwise have been. In this paper, I will ultimately consider to what degree Stanchik's ethic is non-consequentialist and also whether it succeeds in its person-regarding aims. In conclusion, I'll briefly consider an alternative approach, but first I will review how Stanchik arrives at his ethic. Stanchik rejects a utilitarian consequentialist approach when it tells us to maximize total expected utility. This is because he thinks, first, it can imply maximizing total utility by greatly increasing the size of the human population, even though each person will have a life only barely worth living, what's known as the repugnant conclusion. And secondly, it can imply imposing enormous sacrifices on the current generation because investing what it would consume will yield greater overall utility in the future. Am I speaking at a reasonable rate? Yes. He introduces rights to show that we do not have a duty to do whatever is best for future generations, only to see to it that they live in a world where their rights are respected. He also seeks to make dealing with the non-identity problem, quote, irrelevant, end quote, to an appropriate ethic for climate change, though he does not deny facts that underlie the problem. These facts are that future people will not be harmed in the sense of made worse off than they would otherwise have been by the bad effects of climate change. This is because if we hadn't followed policies that lead to bad effects of climate change, those people probably wouldn't have existed so they can't be worse off than they otherwise would have been. That is, instituting policies that prevent the bad effects would result in many different interactions and behaviors, different matings and births. In turn, this will result in certain future people who would otherwise have existed, not existing, and different people existing instead. It is those different people who would have lives without the bad effects of climate change, though they would not be better off than they would otherwise have been, since they wouldn't have existed if policies leading to the bad effects had occurred. Further, so long as those whose very existence is conditional on policies that lead to the bad effects of climate change have lives worth living, it seems hard to see how they would have been wronged in being created, given that they couldn't have been made better off. Now, Stanchik is just assuming that generations not too far distant will be affected by the non-identity problem. That's an empirical question, but I'll just assume what he assumes. Given these facts, Stanchik says, quote, from the perspective of a non-consequentialist and person-regarding view of intergenerational justice, it's not clear why the present generation has a duty to rapidly reduce its consumption growth, even if this is necessary to avoid triggering climate tipping points that will eventually prove catastrophic. For it appears that the people who will live through such catastrophes will not be benefited if we do. So from a non-utilitarian and person-regarding point of view, how should we reason about intergenerational justice, end quote. In seeking an appropriate person-regarding climate ethics, Stanchik is seeking an alternative to the view that even if we couldn't affect particular future persons for the better by preventing climate change, we should create better off rather than worse off people. This is known as a non-person affecting approach, since the identities of the people who are better and worse off change, and no person is affected for the better or worse. Of course, sometimes this approach is described as a wide person affecting view, since it does not merely interpersonally aggregate all benefits, but calculates benefits within individual persons' lives. But I'll here refer to it as non-person affecting. Stanchik's person-regarding ethic seems to be what is more commonly known as a person-affecting ethic, since it seeks to show how preventing or not preventing climate change can make particular people better or worse off, holding identity of the people constant, and affecting them for better or worse. Stanchik's emphasis on person affectingness and rights in his account of non-consequentialism, that's what he emphasizes. However, it should be noted that non-consequentialism does not deny that consequences, including non-person affecting ones, matter morally. It just denies that consequences are all that matter morally. Stanchik thinks that every person, once they exist, has rights not to be subject to famine, drought, resource wars, and other dire effects such as fires and floods on them of climate change. It is protecting these rights, their rights, that require people to undertake burdens to prevent climate change. Other people undertake burdens. However, these burdens may themselves involve limiting some rights, for example, limiting rights to travel and procreate. Suppose for the sake of argument that Stanchik is correct in his view about what rights people have once they exist. It's crucial to Stanchik's person regarding climate ethic that some of the people whose rights will be negatively affected by actions and policies that perpetuate climate change already exist. He focuses on the children, quote, born yesterday, end quote, who in several decades within their lifetimes will experience such direct effects of climate change as fires and floods. That is, they are not people whose identities would change depending on what climate policies will now be followed. Note that the emphasis on these people is inconsistent with another of his views, that current societies have no self-interested reason to prevent climate change because its worst effects will only be felt hundreds of years from now, when those in existence now will already be dead. I'm just going to overlook that inconsistency in his paper. It is also important to Stanchik's person regarding ethic that besides the direct bad effects of climate change, such as fires and floods, there's another way that the children already alive can be affected by future actions and policies of adults that lead to climate change. His examples illustrate how those children, call them Generation 1, could have to bear the burden when they grow up of preventing climate change from directly negatively affecting the rights of the next generation of children, call them Gen 2, who will already be alive during the lifetimes of Gen 1 and before some of Gen 1's climate affecting behavior. I will refer to these burdens of prevention as indirect bad effects on Generation 1 of climate change. Hence, Gen 1 will suffer burdens from climate change and also suffer burdens to prevent climate change. Stanchik surmises that the indirect burden on Generation 1 in terms of restricting their consumption and reproduction will be greater than the burden to prevent climate change would have been had those who were adults when Generation 1 were children reduced luxury consumption. Further, when Generation 1 become adults, they will face greater indirect burdens than the preceding generation would have had to bear to prevent the additional indirect burdens that Gen 2 would have to undergo to prevent further rights-violating effects of climate change on Generation 3 children, who will pre-exist some of Generation 2's possibly climate-affecting behavior. Stanchik refers to, quote, kicking the can, end quote, of increasing burdens to stop climate change down the road as the fundamental problem of intergenerational justice. Am I still coming through? Yes. Good. Stanchik's additional view is that giving appropriate weight to diverse claims, another term claims he uses as equivalent to rights, and deciding which claim to limit to protect other claims is a matter of considering the seriousness of the interests protected by those claims and how serious the setback of those interests would be if the claim is not protected. For example, he says, quote, if everyone's right to avoid unnecessary famine is more urgent or basic than anyone's claim to eat grass-fed beef or travel long distances by plane for vacation, then we already know what we are morally required to do as a matter of intergenerational justice. Dramatically restrict emissions from animal agriculture and dramatically restrict aviation emissions from tourism, end quote. Now, given all this description, one of my questions about Stanchik's consequentialist person regarding proposal is how non-consequentialist it is. I ask this question without assuming that non-consequentialism is the correct view or aiming to defend it. I'm not doing that. Consider first whether it is consistent with non-consequentialism to decide which claims should be restricted or sacrificed by the strength of the interest they protect. First, from a non-consequentialist point of view, when one's actions involve harming others, one might have to sacrifice a right protecting a stronger interest to prevent others from suffering setback of a right protecting their weaker interest. For example, suppose the current generation would have to give up much future aviation to avoid causing fires due to climate change that will directly affect children already alive decades later when those children become adults. Further, suppose, contrary to Stanchik's surmise about future costs rising, those children when adults could prevent those fires at a somewhat lesser cost to them than giving up much aviation would cost the current adults. On a non-consequentialist view, we may not be justified in making the potential victim of the harmful act pay to prevent the fires simply because the cost to them would be less than the cost of not engaging in aviation or preventing the fires would be to those whose behavior would cause the fires. From a non-consequentialist perspective, it is not necessarily true that whoever would sacrifice a claim involving a lesser interest should pay in order to prevent the harm. Rather, there's more reason for the potential harmer to pay to avoid the act or to pay to correct the effects of the act. Second, non-consequentialists also typically draw a moral distinction between harming and not aiding. So consider a case in which adults in one generation, which I will call the parent generation or Gen P, do nothing to causally contribute to direct effects of climate change, such as fires and floods. However, the children of their generation would suffer such direct bad effects of climate change when they become adults due to the acts of the grandparents or Gen Grand. That generation, having done acts like after retirement, traveling around the world, that took place after those children already came to exist. They already had grandchildren. Suppose the cost in terms of limitations on rights to Gen P to prevent these direct bad effects of climate change on the children's generation would be less than the cost to the children's generation. And unfortunately, Gen Grand is no longer available to bear the cost, having passed away. From a non-consequentialist point of view, Gen P would not have a duty to pay the cost to help the children's generation merely because that cost was less than the cost the children's generation would have to pay to help themselves. The non-consequentialist view is that you need not pay a price, for example, by yielding a right, to help others simply because others would suffer infringement of a more serious right if you did not help than you would suffer if you did help. Ranking the seriousness of rights by the seriousness of the interest they involve does not determine whether someone has a duty to sacrifice a less serious right or others may infringe it to prevent someone else's loss of a more serious right in cases that involve merely aiding rather than not harming others. For example, you needn't give up your arm, nor may it be taken in order to save someone else's life from an aggressor's attack. You are morally permitted to give greater weight to your arm than to another's life when it is a matter of only aiding, though you have the option of making the morally admirable sacrifice. Indeed, Stanchik's view that the ranking of rights by interests does determine the duty or permission to infringe might be described as a form of rights consequentialism. This form of consequentialism involves treating the protection of rights in accordance with their seriousness as a good to be maximized rather than maximizing utility. Thus, that Stanchik's proposal emphasizes rights does not necessarily imply that the proposal is non-consequentialist. By contrast, on a non-consequentialist view, rights are treated more like side constraints, so that respecting less serious rights of some people might stand in the way of maximizing protection of other people's even more serious rights. The distinction between consequentialism and non-consequentialism drawn here depends on where rights are put, into the theory of value identifying the goods to be brought about, or instead in the so-called theory of the right, which is about what one may or may not do in virtue of an individual's rights in order to bring about what has value. Stanchik speaks of more and less serious claims, a term he uses, as I said, interchangeably with rights, based on the interests they involve. However, he usually contrasts claims that involve strong interests in absolute terms, not to die in fires, for example, with claims that involve trivial interests in absolute terms, for example, eating meat. Non-consequentialism may require sacrificing claims that involve trivial interests, even in cases of merely aiding those that one has not harmed. Hence, especially in cases of simply aiding, it would be better to attend to the significance of sacrifices in absolute terms, small or large, or even more particularly described, rather than merely attending to their relative, less or more serious significance, as Stanchik's principles do. Furthermore, while Stanchik speaks in terms of infringement of less serious or more serious rights, note that not all costs to protect rights that he thinks exist will themselves involve infringement of rights. For example, having a high six-figure income in US dollar terms is not a right. Suppose it would cost a later generation 25% of that income to protect the rights of people already alive, but it would cost an earlier generation 10% of that income to protect the rights of the same group of people. On a non-consequentialist view, it is not the duty of the earlier generation to pay the lesser cost to prevent the later generation having to pay the greater cost to prevent the rights violation. Now, what has been said about only aiding from a non-consequentialist point of view may also bear on Stanchik's claim that he provides a person regarding justification for duties to prevent climate change for each generation over the entire course of history. Can you still hear me? Yes. He says, the reasoning illustrated, quote, the reasoning illustrated is able to establish an unending chain of person regarding non-utilitarian intergenerational obligations that is indifferent to the identity of future generations. It is sometimes said that thinking about intergenerational ethics exclusively in terms of what we owe to our younger contemporaries ignores the independent claims of as yet unborn future generations. But as I've just shown, that is a mistake. It is an essential part of the explanation for wrongdoing that I have given, that is to say, Stanchik has given, that future people will have moral claims on everyone as soon as they come into existence, and that unless decisive steps are taken in the present, even greater sacrifices will then be morally necessary to honor these rights on pain of grave injustice, end quote. Is this, I ask, unending chain of person-regarding obligations necessarily present, for example, in the following case? Suppose that some people, Gen P, parent generation, in the presence of already existing children, engage in activities that contribute to climate change. However, the direct negative effects, like fires and floods, are delayed so that neither these children, Generation 1, nor the next generation of children, Generation 2, are affected. Further, assume that when Generation 1 and Generation 2 become adults, they will not add to climate change. They do not undergo great sacrifices to make this happen. In this case, Gen P's behavior does not produce direct negative effects, like fires, on Generation 1, people already existing when Gen P acts, or Gen 2 people, but only Generation 3, who, let us assume, still have lives worth living. People in Generation 3 would not already have existed when Gen P acted, and they may owe their existence to Gen P's acts that result in eventual bad effects of climate change. If so, they will not be worse off as a result of Gen P's acts than they would have been had Gen P acted differently, since they wouldn't have existed if Gen P had acted differently. Stanchik's crucial claim that those already in existence at the time of the climate changing behavior will eventually be harmed by direct bad effects of that behavior will not hold in this case. However, might those already existing when Gen P acts, that is to say, Generation 1, suffer indirect person-regarding bad effects from Gen P's acts? This would be so if Gen 1 would have to pay to prevent climate rights violations to Gen 3 that would occur when Gen 3 exists. The argument for this might be as follows. For Generation 2 to prevent conditions that will violate Gen 3's rights will be very costly. For example, in terms of Gen 2 not exercising certain of its rights. It would be less costly for Gen 1 to prevent the violations. Hence, instead of kicking the cost can down the road to Gen 2, Gen 1 should bear the cost. But that means that Gen 1, who already existed when Gen P acted in ways that resulted in climate change, will be made worse off as a result of Gen P's actions. Gen 1 may not suffer from climate change, but they would suffer to prevent its effects on Gen 3 by way of preventing indirect costs on Gen 2. However, this argument depends first on Gen 1 and Gen 2, who did nothing by hypothesis to contribute to climate change, having to bear non-trivial burdens so that Gen 3's rights are respected. And secondly, it depends on Gen 1 having to bear burdens for Gen 3's sake, simply because those will be less than Gen 2 and Gen 3's burdens would be. It has already been suggested that nonconsequentialism might not endorse the view that one has to bear a non-trivial burden simply because it would be less than the burden someone else would bear. Nonconsequentialism might also not endorse the view that those who did not cause a harm have a duty to prevent a harm caused by others at non-trivial cost. Gen P may have significant responsibilities to prevent violation of Gen 3's rights not to be subject to floods or droughts, for example, by creating a fund for use after Gen P passes away. But this obligation would not be based on person-regarding considerations, since Gen 3 did not already exist when Gen P acted, and identities of those in Gen 3 may have depended on Gen P's having acted as they did. Hence, dealing with the non-identity problem would not be made irrelevant to deriving these duties of Gen P's in this case and others of its kind, contrary to what Stanchik might wish. Ordinarily, it would seem to be good if we can easily delay the direct bad effects of climate change. Ordinarily, it is also good if intervening generations after original climate change actors do not contribute additionally to bad climate change. However, in cases where costs of preventing bad effects increase as time goes on, the two factors of delay in bad direct effects and innocent intervening generations, combined with non-consequentialist concerns about duties to merely aid, may create problems for establishing, quote, an unending chain of person-regarding, non-utilitarian, intergenerational obligations that is indifferent to the identity of future generations, end quote, from Stanchik. Now, a variation on this case raises an additional issue. Suppose out of concern for Generation 1, Gen P arranges for the bad direct effects on climate of its acts to be delayed until Generation 3. But this makes their effects much worse for Generation 3 than the effects would have been if felt by Generation 1. Those in Generation 3 would not have existed with, assuming we are, lives worth living, had Gen P not acted as they did. In this case, Stanchik's approach seems to imply that to avoid person-regarding harms and wrongs to people in Generation 1 already in existence when Gen P acts, Gen P should do what imposes a much worse burden in absolute terms on people in Gen 3. I owe this variation on my case to Michael Otsuka. Doing this, acting in this way by Gen P seems morally problematic, even if one should reject what Parfit called the no difference view, according to which there is no moral difference between creating a person who was worse off than someone else one could have created and making someone worse off than they could have been. Contrary to the no difference view, as Jeff has argued, it seems morally worse to produce pollution that will cause someone to die at 60 rather than 65, by contrast to producing pollution that will cause one to create someone who will live to 60 rather than create another person who will live to 65. Now, this is a case in which the already existent person is harmed by losing 5 years of life from 65 to 60, but it might be asked if it is worse to fail to improve the climate for existing people, thus failing to aid them, than to fail to create people who will live in a better climate than people who will live in a worse climate. In any case, deciding to what degree to give preference to the interests of G1 by person-regarding behavior, either by harming or not aiding, rather than to G3, Gen 3, by non-person-regarding behavior, will require dealing with the non-identity problem. It is worth noting that in one paper, Jeff ends by hoping that the no difference view can withstand his criticisms of it. And in another paper, he ends by hoping that there is even more reason to doubt the no difference view. Like all the greats, Jeff contains multitudes. I've argued, contrary to Stanchik, that thinking about intergenerational ethics exclusively in terms of what we owe to our younger contemporaries can sometimes ignore what he thinks are the rights of as yet unborn future generations. I've also argued that according to non-consequentialism, the choice between greater and lesser sacrifices need not always morally require that lesser sacrifices be made. However, Stanchik's claim that future people will have moral claims as soon as they come into existence might be important on its own in a non-consequentialist approach to climate change, if not in the way that Stanchik emphasizes. I will very briefly consider a different rights-related view that does not seek to make the non-identity problem irrelevant, but may help deal with it. Though, again, I think that Jeff, in his own work, denies that this is possible. If we create people whose lives are worth living and could not have better due to non-identity with those whose lives would have been better, this may not show, I think, that we have not violated these people's rights in some way. For example, suppose that our act necessary for creating someone with a life worth living is the very act that as a side effect unavoidably sets a delayed action bomb that will kill the person when he's 20. Call this the delayed action bomb case. We could also imagine that the agent in this case is a whole generation, a nation state, corporate entity whose acts affect many people. Thinking only about this person we create, I think that we should at least not feel free to do the act that will kill him simply because he would not otherwise exist with a life worth living, despite being killed in this way. I would say the same about the following two variations on this case. First, our setting a bomb that will kill the person when he's 20 is a necessary means to being able to create him, not a mere side effect of the act of creating him. Second case, variation. Our setting up a machine that will cause us, when the person is 20, to then trigger a bomb in order to kill him is what is necessary in order for us to be able to create the person. That machine will cause us to do that. My view of these cases seems to conflict with some parts of the following argument given by Johann Frick, which are intended to support Jeff's views, which he has expressed elsewhere, but in particular in his Lanson lectures. I will divide Frick's argument into three parts, keeping in mind this is to support Jeff's views as Frick sees them. I hope he is not astray. First part, quote, A has a right against X, for example, against something bad happening to her, or against something, forget about bad, something happening to her, only if there are circumstances such that A would rationally prefer that her right against X not be infringed, end quote, from Frick. If there are no circumstances in which A would rationally prefer that the supposed right against X not be infringed, then Frick claims there is no right. Second part of the argument. If someone's life that is worth living cannot exist without something bad happening to him, then there is no circumstance in which that person would rationally prefer that the bad thing not happen or have happened to him. Third part. Given Frick's view about rights given in the first part of the argument, there is no right if you couldn't possibly object to bringing it about, if it's necessary to bring about life worth living. And given the person described in second part of the argument, a particular person will have a life worth living with something bad happening to them, this person would lack a right against the bad thing happening to him. That's the third step conclusion in the argument. Now, one concern I have with this argument deals with a case in which someone suffers greatly and uninterruptedly for many years, for example, 20 years of intense pain and nausea, but then has far more years of a happy, meaningful life. It might be true that the life was overall worth living, but from the point of view of someone in the process of living the life, it might be reasonable for them to give priority to avoid the great suffering, even if it means foregoing the greater good in the rest of their life. Call this the no suffering priority case. If so, then even though someone's life that is worth living cannot exist with something bad happening to them, that person, I think, could rationally prefer that the bad thing not happen to them. This conflicts with part 2 of Frick's argument, which says, quote, that if someone's life that is worth living cannot exist without something bad happening to him, then there is no circumstance in which that person would rationally prefer that the bad thing not happen to him, end quote. Hence, in this case, if someone would rationally prefer that the bad thing not happen to them, in bringing the person into existence, we might infringe their right not to have the bad thing happen to them, and as a consequence, have infringed their right not to have been created. This is so even though their life would be overall worth living. A second concern I have about Frick's argument is connected to its implication that the person in all of my delayed action bomb cases does not have a right not to be killed. Can you still hear me? Yes. Suppose it is true that he did not have a right not to be created, despite how his life ends. Suppose he didn't have a right not to be created. I, unlike Frick and I think Jeff, do not think this means that the person lacks a right not to be killed by the bomb when he's 20. That is, I think there will still be an infringement of his right not to be killed caused either by the act that creates him, the act that is necessary means to creating him, or the act that must occur when he is 20 that kills him. I here use infringement to cover both permissible and impermissible infringements. This is so even if he has no right not to have been created to such a life containing the infringement, because the good of the life outweighs the right's infringement. This seems to conflict with the first part of Frick's argument, that if there are no circumstances in which person A would rationally prefer that a supposed right not be infringed, then there is no right. The right in question now is the right not to be killed by the bomb, not the right not to have been created to a life worth living in which he is killed by the bomb. On the Frick and I think McMahan view, there is no right the person has in these cases that provides any reason at all, let alone a sufficient or requiring reason not to create his life. Suppose for the sake of argument that there is still a right not to be killed that is infringed in the delayed action bomb cases. That a person could have no rational objection on his own behalf to having been created to such a life with the infringement may not be enough to put to rest a moral concern from the agent's point of view to creating the person. After all, the agent will be responsible for infringing the person's right at age 20. Looked at in reverse, if an agent has a concern about creating the person when he can't create anyone else, this might be accounted for by there being a right that will be infringed. And so the concern might be some grounds for thinking that there is such a right. One possible reason for an agent giving priority to not doing what will infringe the person's right, though I don't want to claim that in the case of the delayed action bomb, they would give priority, even though doing it is necessary to give the person a life worth living, one reason they might give priority is that there is no one who will be deprived of a benefit or made worse off or wronged if they are not created with a life worth living. By contrast, when someone is already in existence, there may be no sufficient reason for an agent to give priority to not doing the act that infringes the person's right. This is so if doing the act is the only thing that can provide someone with 20 years of overall worthwhile living, without which he would be worse off than the person, and the person does not object to its being done. On the account just given, the agent who gives priority to not infringing the right rather than creating a person relies on what I would call an agent-focused reason, since the reason focuses on the agent's concern about what he does, independent of any objection or complaint that would be had by the person created. The latter objection would be called a victim or patient-focused objection or complaint. However, this leaves it open that sometimes if the act necessary to create a person to a life worth living also infringes or it leads to an infringement of that person's rights, an agent may also refuse to create for the sake of what could be called a patient-focused, rights-related reason. This is so even if we can imagine that a hypothetical person would themselves sacrifice the right to have a life worth living, and so not have a patient-focused objection to having been created. That is, the agent may be better positioned to uphold respect for a right that is connected to the status of being a person than someone who would have the right, placing respect for that right ahead of creating a life overall worth living. This is so when giving priority to non-infringement of the right does not endanger the potential patient's interests because there is no one in existence whose rights are negatively affected by not being created. Such an account would be patient-focused by focusing on the potential patient's right, even if it doesn't focus on the potential patient's interests overall and any complaints they could have on their own behalf once in existence to having been created. Such an account seems to imply that focusing on the patient's right could stand in the way of creating the person without the person being in a position once they exist to claim that they had a right not to have been created. This exemplifies a different version of what I have elsewhere described as a concern with, quote, rights beyond interests, end quote. In this version, it is not that the right that would be infringed is important independent of its effects on the person's interests, such as a right not to be lied to. It is that the creating agent can afford to give less weight to the person's overall interests that would make their life worth living than the weight the person themselves would give to their overall interest once they exist. This account takes a perspective on creating that is ex ante to the creation rather than imagining what a person who's created would think from a perspective ex post their creation. It is this perspective that could lead an agent to think that there is not only some rights-related moral reason not to create, patient-focused rights-related reason not to create, but it is actually morally wrong to create someone who would certainly be a slave, when anyone the agent could create would be a slave. This is so even though that person would still have a life overall worth living, even as a slave. Ex ante, the agent may not unreasonably, I think, give priority, and could even be wrong not to give priority, to avoiding the gross attack on human rights and dignity involved in slavery. This is so even once someone exists with a life worth living, he would see himself as the beneficiary of someone's wrongdoing in their not having given such priority, that was the wrongdoing, and thus themselves have no personal complaint in having been created. Further, the agent could be wrong not to give such priority. Even if once a person exists, they would submit to slavery for the sake of having a life still worth living, and an agent acting on their behalf could facilitate this. Of course, in creating people, it is reasonable to believe that during their lifetime, some of their rights may be violated, even by the people who created them, and unavoidably so. This possibility is often not a sufficient reason not to create the people. Hence, the alternative view to which I've gestured faces the problem of distinguishing between the expected rights infringements, or even bad states of affairs not involving rights infringements, that do and those that do not sufficiently morally justify or even require not creating, even if one cannot create something better. In particular, it is an open question whether the bad effects of climate change, even if they involved infringements of rights, are of the sort that would sufficiently justify or even require not creating a life that would still be worth living. Possibly the following case provides an example. Stanchik believes that one of the effects of climate change will be the displacement of large numbers of people seeking to emigrate. Suppose this is so, and that it will certainly lead to severely demeaning and inhumane treatment of large numbers of migrants. Suppose these people would still have lives worth living, and we cannot create better off people. The creating generation might be right to give priority to not having people demeaned and treated inhumanely, rather than creating people who will be treated that way, but also have lives worth living. Giving priority to avoiding such disrespect of persons, if only by creating fewer rather than more such people for the impersonal good that continuing the species would involve. Avoiding disrespect of persons to some degree in our creation policies could be justified in part because there is no one who is harmed or wrong in not being created. Hence, in dealing with the non-identity problem in the context of climate change, it could be important to know what, if any, climate-related rights people will have once they exist. This is so if an agent could sometimes have both agent-focused and victim-focused rights-related reasons, even if not sufficient or requiring reasons, for not creating someone, when the very act that makes it possible for someone to exist is also an act that will infringe or lead to infringement of rights they have once they exist. Such right-related reasons might exist even if in creating someone, the agent doesn't make them worse off than they would otherwise have been, and everyone has a life worth living. These rights-related reasons might be sufficient for an agent to create a different set of people whose rights would not be infringed were this possible. But they might sometimes create the different people because it would be wrong to bring about the people whose rights would be infringed, not because it would be wrong, other things equal, not to create better off rather than worse off people, which is Jeff's view. Thank you for your attention, or if you've fallen asleep, I excuse you. Okay, that's the end of my talk.
We'll have the response by Linda Eggert from Oxford.
What?
Well, like many people here, I owe a debt of profound gratitude to Jeff So it's wonderful to be here and to celebrate him with so many other giants on whose shoulders I stand. And one giant is right there. Actually, this feels like how I spent much of my existence, with Francis Kamm looming over me. I'm not at home in climate ethics. I've read Stanchik's paper and Francis's response. So that's the basis of my comments. So I'll raise a few clarificatory questions, and then some questions about what else a non-consequentialist account might say. There'll be 6 questions in total. First, I think Kamm is right to question what role the comparison place on which Stanchik relies in a suggestion that if we don't make certain sacrifices, then other younger and future people will have to make even greater sacrifices. So Kamm says there's no duty to sacrifice a less serious right just because it's less serious than what someone else would have to sacrifice. And one question is, does it also go the other way? So imagine that future generations can much more easily address the harmful effects of climate change than we can. Now, if we had to sacrifice much more than what future generations will have to sacrifice, could that count as a reason for us not to have to make that sacrifice? So the question is precisely, what is it that we should resist here? The comparison in general, or specifically what Stanchik takes it to imply? Namely that those who sacrifice would be less serious should, for that reason, make it. Although, perhaps, those who sacrifice would be greater shouldn't have to make it, partly for that reason. That is, if we deny, together with Kamm, that a sacrifice being less serious than someone else's is a reason to make it, must we also deny that a sacrifice being more serious than someone else's is a reason not to make it? Second point. Not sacrificing a certain degree of present-day consumption results not just in threats of greater climate harms to future generations who don't yet exist, as Francis mentioned. It also makes it harder for people who already exist to fulfill their climate-related duties because the burdens of prevention increase. Now, these people, as Kamm put it, and this is a quote, may not suffer from climate change, but they would suffer to prevent its effects to people in the further future. Now, Stanchik suggests that insofar as we're concerned with just one generation's duties to the next generation, so Gen P's duties to the next generation, Gen 1, in Kamm's language, we effectively avoid the non-identity problem, Stanchik suggests, since generation 1 already exists. So their identities don't depend on what generation P does. What Gen P does affects only how much Gen 1 will be burdened. Okay, so being able to circumvent the non-identity problem, I take it would be convenient, given the slightly awkward question of how we could wrong any future people who don't yet exist by causing or failing to prevent climate change, given that those people who will exist then won't exist otherwise. After all, there's no counterfactual in which those same future people exist and we didn't do what has catastrophic consequences in the future. Now, Kamm is skeptical about Stanchik's proposal that we can establish what he describes as, quote, this unending chain of person regarding non-utilitarian intergenerational obligations that is indifferent to the identity of future generations. The worry, simply put, is that so long as we're concerned with what we owe to people in the future who don't yet exist, then of course the non-identity problem will just continue to rear its head. So, again, and this is just to clarify, what if we just don't appeal at all to duties to future people who don't yet exist, and appeal only to duties not to unduly, whatever that ultimately means, increase the burdens for overlapping future generations. So the concern would be not with duties to prevent suffering from climate change directly, but with duties to prevent suffering associated with preventing its effects. So the question is, what, from a non-consequentialist perspective, would we lose? In what respects would an account be less compelling, focused not on duties to people whose identities will change depending on what climate policies we follow, but only on duties to people who already exist, who will be negatively affected by actions and policies that perpetuate climate change? Okay. Third question. In response to the non-identity problem, one challenge is to explain how future people's rights will be infringed by climate harms, although those same people won't exist without the acts that also bring about those threats of harm. Now, Kamm's response to the Frick/McMahan argument that you mentioned includes the statement that, and again, this is a quote which you heard earlier, if someone would rationally prefer that the bad thing not happen to him, in bringing the person into existence, we might infringe their right not to have the bad thing happen to them, and as a consequence, have infringed their right not to have been created. Now, something I'd like to ask you to clarify here is, why is bringing that person into existence the thing that infringes their right not to be killed by the bomb, in Francis' example? And why would it be as a consequence of infringing their right not to be killed by the bomb that we infringe their right not to have been created, assuming for the sake of argument there is such a right? Now, a second concern that Kamm raises in this context is that Frick's argument, he says, implies that the person in the delayed action bomb case has no right not to be killed. Now, Kamm doubts that not having a right not to be created, quote, means that the person lacks a right not to be killed by the bomb. She says, this is another quote, there'll still be an infringement of his right not to be killed, because either by the act that creates him, the act that is a necessary means to create him, or the act that must occur when he's 20 that kills him in this delayed action bomb case. Now, I think she's completely right to conclude that his right not to be killed is infringed. But I wonder about the appeal to three rather different possibilities. So why should the act of creating someone at T1, or indeed something that's a necessary means to creating someone, infringe the right not to be killed 20 years after T1? So isn't creating someone just a precondition for the possibility of infringing rights that they will have once they exist? Why isn't it, arguably more straightforwardly, just the act that kills them that infringes the right not to be killed? After all, arguably, people aren't wronged by being created if later bad things happen to them. They're wronged by having things done to them that are impermissible to do to them once they exist, given the rights that they'll have. Okay, so much for just broadly clarificatory questions. Now, one main broader question Francis is interested in is how non-consequentialist Stanchik's account ultimately is. And so here are a few questions about what else a non-consequentialist account of intergenerational climate justice might address. So Kamm characterizes questions of what we owe to future generations as being about merely aiding rather than harming, which matters in part because not harming is a stronger duty than not aiding. But I wonder if the climate question isn't a bit more complicated. For example, acting in ways that worsen climate change and not reducing consumption may not be exactly like creating a new threat or redirecting an existing threat, but maybe it's a bit of both. And I also wonder whether failing to reduced consumption might be a bit like ducking increasing burdens of prevention, in the sense that by failing to bear certain burdens, and thereby increase for future generations, we essentially deny them the protection from climate harms. So we might consider Kamm's lazy Susan case here, in which the trolley can't be stopped, but there's, the five are on the swivel table that can be moved out of the way of the trolley, but that movement then causes a rock slide that kills the bystander. And so maybe there's a climate version of this case where there's lots of swivel tables, all sort of one after the other with different generations on them, and they can move themselves out of the way of the approaching trolley. And so the trolley would then represent the, in this case, non-lethal burdens of preventing harms to future generations, and the rock slides caused as a side effect of evading such burdens would represent the harms of climate change itself. So I haven't thought this through, but this is just a starting point of how one might think about these cases. Okay. Point 5. In response to Stanchik's kicking the can down the road problem, another issue a non-consequentialist account might address is whether the fact that Gen 1 is wronged by previous generations, JP, might imply that the sacrifice that Gen 1 has to make is smaller than it would be if Gen P had complied with its climate duties, because the sacrifice Gen 1 would have to make would be smaller if Gen P had complied with its moral obligations to Gen 1. So this isn't to suggest that two wrongs make right, nothing at all of the sort. Rather have in mind something like a Liam Murphy-style kind of fair shares view, according to which Gen 1 shouldn't have to bear greater costs than if it would if Gen P had done what they were required to do. And perhaps a main alternative would be that Gen 1 has a duty to basically pick up the slack. So more generally, what's the relationship between person regarding victim-focused rights-related reasons and an account of intergenerational, distributive, and perhaps even rectificatory justice that's concerned with the distribution of climate harm between generations? That is, might there be two related but distinct questions? First, what, if any, climate-related rights will people have once they exist? And second, what might a just distribution of climate-related burdens across time look like? And given the non-identity problem, it might be really convenient if we're able to answer the latter without having to answer the former. Okay, final point. Might future harms that we fail to prevent be rendered proportionate if the acts that cause them also lead to certain benefits in the future? So, for example, present people might be working on all kinds of scientific and technological advances that won't benefit us and that are disastrous for the climate, but that might be hugely beneficial to people in the future. So, in a non-consequentialist view, what matters is arguably what causes harms rather than what benefits certain harms might bring about. So Kamm calls this a downstreamish way of justifying harms. So on a non-consequentialist account then, it might matter what exactly causes, say, harmful emissions. For example, there might be a difference between pure climate-destroying behavior, like with apologies to the Americans, driving around in comically enormous cars, B, climate-destroying behavior that's a necessary means to, say, scientific advances that will prevent harm in the future. And then third, climate-destroying behavior that's a mere side effect of future harm-preventing scientific advances. So perhaps, besides questions about what types of climate-related rights infringements bear on the permissibility of creating future people, we also face distinct questions about familiar non-consequentialist complexities in which Franz has written a ton concerning how harms, in this case climate harms, and certain benefits are brought about, including harming versus non-aiding, harming as a means versus harming as a side effect, and redirecting climate threats versus starting new ones. And she's, as you heard, offered a characteristically rich and intricate view of what that might look like. So with thanks to Frances for a wonderfully stimulating paper, and with thanks to Jeff for so much else, I'll look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I was told I had 5 minutes to respond. So may I take the 5 minutes to respond?
Of course.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. I'm very grateful to Linda Eggert for her close attention to my paper and her creative insights. These are some of Eggert's questions and my brief answers. First, if it would cost future generations less than us to stop climate change, is that a sufficient reason for them to have to pay? From a non-consequentialist perspective, I'd say no. It depends on how much the lesser cost is. It also matters whether they would be paying for their own benefit or for the benefit of yet future generations. Second, she asks, why not appeal only to duties not to unduly increase the burdens to prevent climate change, rather than about preventing direct harm? And this is for overlapping future generations. I discussed something like this in speaking of Generation P having to aid Generation 3, because otherwise Generation 1, who exists already when Gen P does what will affect Generation 3, will have to bear burdens to prevent Generation 2 from paying more to prevent climate change affecting Generation 3, which already exists when Generation 2 is around. Now, I say that from a non-consequentialist perspective, if those in Generation 1 and 2 didn't contribute to climate change, they may not have to bear additional non-trivial burdens. This implies that Generation P's reason to prevent climate change is not based on preventing Generation 1 or Generation 2 from having the burden of doing so. Third, Eggert asks, isn't creating someone just a precondition for the possibility of infringing rights they will have once they exist? And why isn't it just the act that kills him that infringes his right not to be killed? I agree that people's rights are infringed by the act that causes the harm they will suffer once they exist. But by hypothesis, in the first delayed action bomb case, it is the very act that creates the person that has the side effect of setting the bomb that kills someone. So in this case, it is the act that creates the person that impacts the person's right not to be killed. In the first variation of this case, it is the very act introducing the means to create the person that sets the bomb to go off later. So I do think that that very act of creating or using certain means to create is the act that will kill. Fourth, Eggert suggests that failing to reduce consumption might be a little bit like ducking. We essentially deny others our protection from climate change. But from a non-consequentialist perspective, ducking is usually permissible if we don't owe the protection. It's a case of terminating our assistance. Fifth, Eggert notes that benefits from climate change should be weighed against the harms, and that non-consequentialists are concerned with how harm is brought about as a means, side effect, redirection versus starting new ones, or starting new ones causally downstream from a greater good, as in the Lazy Susan case. But we must remember that if the non-identity problem is present, we won't actually be harming anyone in the sense of making them worse off than they would have been if we pollute rather than not. For example, if we produce beneficial medicine in a way that doesn't cause pollution, different people may come to exist than would otherwise have existed. Hence, those people who would have existed if we produced medicine by polluting means, won't be worse off than they would otherwise have been. Sixth, Eggert raises very interesting issues about non-consequentialist distributive principles, such as Murphy's, Liam Murphy's. I believe Murphy thinks that if everyone did their fair share, the burden wouldn't be great on each, so it might not be significant in absolute terms. Non-consequentialists might certainly go along with it. But he also thinks that one needn't do more, as Eggert points out, if others fail to do their part, needn't pick up the slack. So I actually hope that Eggert will pursue these issues further. I am not an expert on climate change per se. I was just invited to discuss non-consequentialism in connection with Stanchik's view, but I hope that Eggert will become the sort of expert we all need. Thank you.
Do you want to reply briefly? Do you want to say something?
Just thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Yes, Victor.
Hi, Francis. Nice to see you. Sorry that you can't be here in person. So I had the question about delayed bomb. So I share your intuition about the delayed bomb case. But I thought it was interesting to compare a case where it doesn't involve non-identity, but otherwise is similar. So can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Sort of, yeah.
People always tell me to speak up. So
you're just a little fuzzy around the edges.
Here's a version of the delayed bomb case that doesn't involve non-identity. So imagine that there's a baby who's going to die immediately. I can save the baby's life by performing an action that will also plant a bomb, which will then kill the now baby when they're 20 years old. So I take it in this non-identity case that many people will have the intuition that it's okay to perform the life-saving action, even though that will result in the bomb going off and killing the person at 20. And so I thought it was worth exploring why we've got this difference in our judgments about the non-identity version and the non-identity version of the case. And one explanation is that in the non-identity case, we can't be acting for the sake of the person who ends up getting killed. So the infringement of their rights can't be justified by the fact that we've acted for their sake, because they were otherwise not going to exist, and so there was no their sake for which to act. Whereas in the child case, we can act for their sake, and we can justify infringing their rights because we're acting for their sake in which it produces a sufficient benefit. So that's one explanation why we might get an asymmetry between these two cases. So I had two questions. One is, do you agree that there's an asymmetry between the cases? And secondly, did you have an alternative explanation of why that was so, or did you think that mine was okay?
Well, I mentioned the asymmetry when I said that once a person is alive, you wouldn't have the same sort of reason not to, set the bomb, because doing that, might actually save their life. They'd be worse off without living for 20 additional years once they are in existence. So I agree with what you said. I think it's just what I said, but it's nice to have it amplified.
I just want to know more about the explanation, though. So what was the explanation?
Well, but the explanation I offered, was that if you don't create the person, right, there is no one who was worse off or harmed or wrong in not being created. Whereas if you don't set the bomb to help the person who's already in existence, they will be worse off in not getting the benefits of the treatment that, unfortunately also results in the bomb going off. So that was my explanation.
So I must have missed that.
I'm sorry if it didn't come across clearly.
Yeah, sorry, I must have missed that.
Thanks. Can you hear me, Francis?
Yes.
Okay, good. So suppose that someone is convinced by both you and Lucas that we really need a non-consequentialist explanation of our intuitions in non-identity cases, and they take on board that there are all sorts of cases of climate change where rights could be violated in the way that you've described, but then they discover, conveniently, if they the non-sacrificial option for them could involve making the case that those in the future, because of something you say you release in the atmosphere, just have shorter lifespans and maybe lesser capacities, but that just doesn't involve the sorts of rights violations you talk about, killing or making them servile. And then they say, great. And then we'd still have the very strong intuition. Assuming that had we done the more sacrificial thing, that another group of people, let's suppose same number, would have existed with lives much better, that this is horribly wrong. And don't we now have to then appeal to a consequentialist reason, maybe just restricted to same number cases? Because I don't think consequentialism has to be total maximizing. So wouldn't a case like that show that ultimately we actually do need, that consequentialism has to play a large role in explaining the wrongness of non-identity cases?
Yeah. So I didn't mean to say that only non-consequentialism, should play a role in climate change. I mean, I didn't want to make that claim. I was just trying to argue against those who say that it can't possibly, rights can't possibly play a role. Okay. Now, with respect to it being wrong to not create the better people, I don't think it always is wrong not to create the better people. I certainly don't think we have to be on this, ladder that leads us to always create better and better and better and better and better people. I have this case, what I call the 140 IQ case. You could have had a child with 160 IQ. You decide, well, it's too difficult for the family to deal with that. I wouldn't, give a medicine or a drug to a child who already exists to reduce its 160 IQ to 140. They have rights over their, excellent capacities. But if I want to change the embryo that would have the 160 IQ to an embryo, I fiddle around with the same person, right? Or, I use another embryo. As your case, it's a non-identity case that gives a 140 IQ child. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that there could be a reason not to do it, but I don't think it's significantly wrong. So I think those are my two responses to your question. I don't know if they're satisfactory.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think really Michael more or less asked my question, because I was going to say, while I can see that there are non-consequentialist arguments that you can use here, it does seem to me that it misses the larger point that even in non-identity cases with climate change, the overall level of well-being or other factors, if you don't want to just be a hedonistic utilitarian, you can talk about the richness of life and the other values that come into it, that they are going to be severely diminished for many generations because of climate change. So, but I think you answered to Michael that you are prepared to take something like that into account, and if that's so, then...
Yeah, but I also don't want to get on the ladder of maximizing, well, it could have been better, it could have been better, it could have, they could have been 200 IQ geniuses with insight into, there all could be Mahlers or something.
But this is not harming, if you don't want to get into maximizing, which I would be happy to get into, but if you don't want to, would you support the idea that we shouldn't make things worse off than they would be if we had not emitted as many greenhouse gases as we are emitting?
We don't not make worse off.
We're not making the people...
No, I mean, suppose we're already at 200 IQ points and I do something that pollutes the atmosphere and we go down to 180 IQ points. Well, I reduce the goodness. I just don't think that that's a serious wrong.
And similarly, you don't think it's a serious wrong if people's lives are less rich, less happy, more filled with suffering?
Well, it depends on what you mean. Suppose they suffer an extra day. Peter, I just don't want to get into this idea that less is always worse and more is always better or significantly better or wrong not to produce it in some way. I just don't want to use those general terms. I don't want to get people hooked up on that. I want to hear the specifics.
Okay.
Sorry, Peter. Thank you for your question.
Clear answer anyway.
I'm glad. Oh my God, I've moved up the ladder. Thank you, Peter.
I wanted to respond to your objection, Francis, to Johann's view about rights, which you think supports my view.
No, he thinks it supports your view.
All right, so he
and from
thinks
what
it
I've read,
supports-
you don't disagree.
Okay. Well, somehow or other, the hope is that in defending Johann against your objection, I may be indirectly defending my view, whether you think that succeeds or not. But I wanted to question the objection that you made to Johann's view. Johann's view is, as you put it, that a person has a right to something only if that person would rationally prefer that right not be infringed in some kind of circumstances. So if there are no circumstances in which the person would prefer the right to be respected or whatever, then there's no right. That's Johann's argument. And you gave what you thought was a counterexample. You said, suppose someone would experience a certain amount of suffering for a period in life, and then for the remainder of the life, experience a greater good, greater happiness than the suffering. And you said this person could rationally prefer not to have the life, that is, not to endure the suffering in order to have the greater happiness. But it seems to me you were...
That was an objection to the second part of his claim, not to the first one. You described the first part of the claim.
Okay,
but this
well,
example I gave... All right, go ahead.
Whichever one it is. I just wanted to say that I think that you're saying that it could be prudentially rational for this person to prefer neither the suffering nor the happiness to both. And what that suggests to me is that if it is really prudentially rational for the person to prefer not to endure the suffering in order to get the happiness, what that shows is that the happiness is not a greater good than the suffering is a bad, for that person.
I disagree. I think that we could look at it...
You can be prudentially rational to prefer the lesser good for your own life. That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, it's a difference between looking at the life from the outside, right? You look at the whole life and you see that there's a much greater good in it than all this 20 years of initial, suffering. But from a person who's living the life, they could say, no way am I going through 20 years of that for this greater good of a human life. Now, some people want to say, I'll go through hell to be with God for eternity. I'm not talking about that sort of situation. I think that there is this real difference. Between the point of view of the experiencer and the point of view of looking at the life from the outside. And it can be prudentially rational to take the point of view of the experiencer. It's not against prudential rationality to do that.
I'm taking the point of view of the experiencer, and I'm suggesting that if it is prudentially rational for the experiencer to prefer not to experience the suffering, that entails that the happiness prudentially is not greater.
I still want to disagree with that. I think that someone could clear-heartedly think of the future and say, my God, that really is an overriding good. That's definitely an overriding good, but I'm not going through this for it. I call it, elsewhere I've described as groveling for the good. It's like being a prioritarian. I'm not going to go down to a certain level, even for the sake of a greater good. There's just this limit. I give priority in certain cases to not going through that without having to deny that what would be produced would be a greater good. Sorry, Jeff. I'm always usually in the wrong when I argue with you, and, so be it. I'm in the wrong.
Sorry, Jeff. So, hi, Francis. Alec here. Francis, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, I'm trying to understand your position on the rights violation or infringement in the bomb case where you create someone with the expectation that they'll have 20 good years and then they'll be blown up by the bomb. Now, I took it that you did not think, correct me if I'm wrong here, you did not think that there was a rights violation in the creation itself, that the rights violation would come about when the bomb goes off, that the person is then in a position to say, hey, I'm being killed by a bomb, that violates my rights. Am I understanding your position right?
Not exactly. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, what I think is that there is a rights violation caused by the act that creates the person. So the person, look, I don't think that this person has a right not to be created. I mean, I think it's a consideration. You know, I mentioned the agent's point of view on rights violating, but I don't think it's significant enough to make it that you ought not to create this person. But the point is that, you know, this comes back to these old cases that Judy Thompson discussed, you know, of the delayed, you know, death. I mean, when does the rights violation occur? At the time the person dies in Florida, 20 years after somebody shot him, or at the time he was shot, you know, and, you know, the paper, the time of the killing. I don't know what I want to say about all that, but I do want to say that it is the very act, whatever act it was, that caused the person to die of the bomb, right, is the act that is the rights violating act.
Okay, so it sounds like
it's the rights violating act. That's all I want to say. Okay, and I do think the person is eventually has the rights violated.
Okay, I got it, I think. So I'm then just puzzled by the view because I don't see the difference between that creation story and any of our creation stories. Every one of us has parents that knew when creating us that something was going to kill us. Now, it doesn't, you know, it's an essential feature of creating mortals that that's the way it worked. And I don't think, I can see you want to jump in. Let me finish the thought.
I said that in the paper.
Oh, okay.
I said that I said that, you know, this view faces a problem of deciding which rights violations would stand legitimately in the way, give a sufficient reason at least not to create. And I said, I don't think all of them do. But the point is that somebody might say there's also a difference between a parent doing something or a creator doing something, right, that they know will lead the person to suffer a rights violation due to the acts of other people that the person will encounter in their lifetime, right? Sure. Or maybe a different act that the parent themselves would do when they slap their kid around, okay? But somebody might say that that's different from the very act of creation being what sets the bomb.
But
now, I don't know whether that's a significant difference. I think that Jeff denies that these distinctions matter in a paper of his. But I do think that the ordinary case that we think of is not the one where the very act that you create is the act that sets the bomb. It's creating someone when you know that some rights violation is going to occur in their life.
But I'm not talking about that, Francis, right? I'm talking about the very act of creation setting the bomb. The bomb is your mortality, right? So suppose I know that in my family tree, there are heart attacks that kill everyone by age 60, right? And I'm going to clone myself to make it simple, right? So I create a little mini-me, and at age 60, the bomb's going to go off. The bomb is the ticker in his heart. I don't think there's any rights violation in view at all. And you seem to think there is.
I think that being mortal, all right, creating someone who's immortal, creating someone who's mortal is not a rights violation. There will be no rights violation depending on how that comes about. If it's something intrinsic, you know, to their nature, as opposed to, you know, the bomb. But I do think that it could be the case that, you know, if you give someone, the only way you can create someone is by giving them heart failure at the age of 60, right? Certainly when you could have done otherwise, that you may have violated their right. I think that that's a very interesting issue that you present, but I don't think that I cannot at the moment put my finger on the difference, but I do want to say that I said that not all of these rights violations or bad things that happen, right, are reasons not to create. That's the bottom line. But whether, creating someone who will die of a heart attack involves creating them, the very act of creating, doing something that violates their right. Do they have a right not to be mortal in the way that they have a right not to be shot by or blown up by a bomb? That's what, this example you're giving hinges on. Is there some sort of right not to be mortal? And I don't think there is a right not to be mortal.
Hi.
What?
Hi, Francis. So my question is on the indirect burden. So the idea that if we don't do something now, the next generation will have to do more, and that itself gives us reason to do something now. So my question is about how that works in practice. So specifically, so I can see that
That's Stanchik's view, right?
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
that's set up, right?
Right. So I'm just kind of wonder how that's going to work in practice. So I can see, for example, if I don't save a Johnny child at the cost of one finger now, someone else is going to can only save the Johnny child at the cost of two fingers. And if they save the child, the anticipation that if I don't do it, they will do it, give me a reason to do it now. So I guess there are two questions here. One is, what if I know that they won't do it? So does the mere fact that the burden is going to be greater give me a reason to do it when I know that they are not going to bear the burden? So I know that the next person is not going to bear the cost of two fingers to save the child. Does that fact still give me a reason to bear the cost of, the cost of one finger to save the child now? So that's one question. The other question is connected, which is, well, what about cases where it's like the borderline case? So suppose we have to save the child at the cost of 5 fingers, but not 6 fingers. So I now know that if I don't save the child at the cost of 5 fingers now, the next person will have to save the child at the cost of 6 fingers, but they are not required to do it. So I push them to the bound of supererogatory. So in that case, does the fact that I increase their burden give me a reason to do it now, given that I know that they are not they're not required to bear that burden? And in fact, you might think, well, I actually benefit them by not doing anything, because if I kind of push them above the level, they don't have to do anything. That's in fact a benefit. So it's not a burden on them, because if I increase their burden so much that they now don't have to do it anymore. So maybe that gives me a reason not to do it, so that I just kind of push their burden off the limits. So yeah, I guess just the general questions about how that works in practice.
Yeah, I don't know if I can get my hand around the examples, but the idea is that, I guess, from a non-consequentialist point of view, if you don't have to give up your finger to save someone's life, suppose that were so, the fact that the next person would have to give up 2 fingers and they would do it does not give you a reason to give up your finger. I don't know if that's your case or not. If you had to give up a finger to save a person, even on a non-consequentialist view, does it add anything? Is it to the strength of your reason? Does it add anything to the strength of your reason to carry out your duty that someone else will have to give up 2 fingers when we could assume that they also have a duty to give up 2 fingers? Well, I just think you should do your duty. I mean, you have a duty to give up a finger, you should do it. You shouldn't, Derek Parfit once said that in the heart of non-consequentialism is, that you shouldn't have to do things if other people, will do them. You shouldn't kill someone, and it's okay if other people kill someone. I don't take that view of non-consequentialism. But if you have a duty, to give up your finger, I don't think that it's affected by whether someone else would have a duty to give up 2 fingers and they would do it if you don't do it. You should just do your duty. I don't know if I've answered your question. That may be because I didn't understand all the complexity of it.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Francis. I'm hoping to ask you a question that you could clarify that might help thinking about Linda's worries about preconditions and Alex's worry just here. Suppose it's the bomb case. I bring you into existence. It sets things in motion so that you would be killed by a bomb at the age of 21. I maybe even know that's the case.
Wait a minute. My case was the case where you'd be killed by the bomb that I set.
Yeah, fine.
Right.
But I know that it's said in a way that maybe I said it, but that you'll die at 21. And then at 19, someone shoots you. Or the person gets hit by a truck. So I'm just giving you an opportunity to say, it doesn't seem then that the bomb didn't kill you. So I'm wondering if the right that I'm violating is if there's a confusion here about exactly what the nature of the right is. I'm inviting you to clarify it, because maybe there's a right against being exposed to a risk or something like that, which I've done, because there's no guarantee, of course, that I'll be killed by the bomb if I do this. And maybe you get 19 great years of life and then you die from something else. So this is not a criticism in any way. It's just a chance. I'm asking you if you could clarify the nature of the right a bit. That might respond to some of the questions that others have raised.
Well, I don't know if I can. I mean, in the particular case you mentioned, if I knew that someone else was going to shoot him at 19, then I would think, well, I won't actually be violating his rights, because at least the right not to be killed at the age of 20. Did I expose him to the risk? Well, it depends on how certain I was that someone else would kill him at 19. If I knew that someone else was going to kill him at 19, I didn't even expose him to the risk of dying from the bomb at 20. So that's my initial response to your question.
So then if you don't know, and he is killed by someone else so I don't know, he is in fact killed by someone else at 19. Now, have I violated his right? And if so, what right?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I haven't really thought about what sort of rights we have against risk. To deliberately, deliberately expose someone to a risk as opposed to foreseen. It's foreseen that there is this risk because that someone may not kill him at 19. I guess I'm not sure. It might depend on how big a risk I think there is of his being killed at 19, whether I violated his right not to be exposed to a risk. And I'm not sure that there is a right not to be exposed to the risk. To a risk of a certain degree of magnitude. Of course, it will vary with, what the risk is going to eventuate in, if it comes about, death or, hair of you losing a hair from your head. I don't know. I'm afraid I can't give any better answer to that question.
Is this a complete surrender? Or I'm sure you'll be gratified. But any further questions? Okay.
If somebody else has a better answer, please give the answer.
Okay.
We're all here to learn.
So,
I just want to ask what Larry just asked, because I didn't understand your answer. So Larry asked, what is the right that you violate in the bomb case by procreating the kid? And Larry's point about the truck is that there's no guarantee that you'll be killed by the bomb. So at best, the right that he can see in the neighborhood that may have been violated was a right not to be exposed to a risk at a high enough level. And he invited you to say, yes, that's the right. But it seems to me you just said, no, that's not the right. And then that leaves me with no clue what your answer was to Larry's question. What is the right that you are violating that the action of procreating in the bomb case, that there's some right that's violated by that action? It's not the right not to be killed by a bomb, because you may not be killed by the bomb. But presumably, whether you violated a right does not depend on whether the truck kills you at 19. So what is the right you are positing? That was the question, and I didn't get your answer.
Yeah, right. I don't have an answer because I'm not me, when I create imaginary cases, I always assume it's certain that something will happen. And I'm not a big, I've been criticized for not dealing with risk cases. But the issue is the same, it seems to me, as if I point a gun at you now, and it's not certain that you're going to die from it, all right, can I be said, if you do die from it, that I violated your right not to be killed? I think I can say that I violated your right not to be killed by the gun going off, even if there was a chance that it wouldn't go off because, or that you wouldn't be killed by it because somebody would come and strangle you before. But then you want to ask, well, suppose it's not certain that I'll be killed by the bomb. Take away the certainty that's always present in Kamm's crazy cases and say it was just a risk. Was there a risk? And, if there is a right against risk, is it that right that was violated when you actually certainly would get killed by the gun going off? I don't think it's the right against risk that gets violated when it's absolutely certain that you'll be killed by my gunshot. So maybe there are two rights here floating around, but my case has always involved certainty, and that's all I can say.